The press.
Okay. It has been quite an interesting 2 days, but we're quite confident about the case that SANEF was able to put forward. I think what was important is that we were able to show the direct link between Julius Malema's statement outside the Zondo Commission. This was when he was calling for heads to actually be cut off, etc., and then the subsequent avalanche of attacks on Twitter. I think that the one important thing was the concession from the EFF's legal team that they're actually appalled by the harassment and the threats and the violence on journalists on the social media Twitter. I think that is quite important. It happened in full view of all of the EFF's leadership. I think it is quite important that somebody who leads the third biggest political party is crystal clear around condemning violence and the threats of violence and harassment and intimidation of journalists, whether on social media or physical. I think that is quite important. I think, though, if Julius Malema had actually conceded to this and issued out a statement when we are appealing for it, we wouldn't have had to spend 2 days in court. I mean, it's a very expensive affair to come to the High Court, and we would have preferred to actually sit around the table, and we would have had these concessions, and we would have come out stronger as a country, because what he is right about is that both the EFF and the South African National Editors Forum play a very important role in strengthening our democracy, and we have to respect the rules of conduct. I think the other issue that we need to clarify is that who are the people that they were going against? These are people that had actually written quite critically against the EFF. Opinion pages are part and parcel of reporting and journalism the world over, and those pages are also open to political parties. I think the EFF, given the depth of education within the party, if there are articles that they are against, they are more than welcome to ask for a right of response, and that is always open to them. I think we should get to a point in this country where we are debating ideas and not attacking individuals. I think you were quite clear where he was trying to do a divide and rule, where he's saying the younger journalists understand the EFF and are very fond of the EFF. It's not the work of journalists to love the EFF. It's the work of journalists to hold those in authority accountable, whether it's those in the governing party or those on the opposition benches. And when we disagree on ideology, let's argue those ideas, but not call people names. Is it necessary to call anybody Satan? No, I don't think so. I think that let's argue the ideas, and that's going to be quite important. I think the one thing that at least emerged from here is that big concession from the EFF that they're actually appalled by the intimidation that followed Julius Malema's speech, and I just think that they need to be clearer, because there might be confusion from some of their supporters in terms of whether what they're doing in the EFF's name is correct or not. I also think that it's important for Julius Malema to condemn even those that do it in his name and are not necessarily known members of the EFF, because when they are saying it in the EFF's name and the EFF does not condemn it, then they are complicit.
And then in terms of the EFF's assertion that they're willing to sit around the table even after this case and speak to SANEF, is the offer still open?
That is still open. We would love to actually engage with the EFF, but what we will not tolerate is the conditions they're putting. We are an elected leadership, and for Julius Malema to set conditions that says so-and-so cannot be part of that meeting, that is not acceptable. We will never impose on them who should be attending that meeting. I think it is important that we sit around the table, whatever the outcome of this judgment is, and actually have a conversation, and a very frank one, and actually understand each other's role in actually helping the South Africa emerge from the mess that it has been under. I think that we wanted that. We wrote twice to the EFF. I engaged with them telephonically to say, let's sit around the table. And we resorted to court out of desperation. We have to protect our journalists, and we have to ensure that they work in an environment that is free of any intimidation and harassment. And as you can remember, we're going towards the elections, a hotly contested elections, and our worry was that if we don't attend to this, it can only get worse. We read just today some of the people that have written around how they've had to self-censor because of the avalanche of attacks that happen on Twitter in the name of the EFF, and we wanted to create an environment where journalists feel safe and they know that they can do their work without fear or favor, and at least there is an institution that can actually stand for them and actually go and argue on their behalf, and that they're not left alone.
And then in terms In terms of the EFF, they also mentioned an argument that the hostile environment was two-way street. So we know how Twitter is there are no rules on Twitter and people are able to say whatever they're stating. Does SANEF completely condone some of the runs that some of these journalists have also written about the EFF and other political parties?
I think let's differentiate between two things. Yes, we can all argue around whether Twitter has rules or not, but it actually does. And more than anything, we live in a society of rules, and those rules should apply whether it's on social media or on public engagements. I don't think that we should throw away the rules of engagement just because it's Twitter. If we did an open season, imagine the dangers that will actually happen. I think also it's important not to forget that just a few years ago, SANEF had to take the BLF to court. And what had the BLF done? They had actually gone to a journalist's home. And one of the things that people on Twitter were doing was threatening to get the addresses of journalists and actually go to their homes. So if we do not act, then we actually have supporters thinking that it's okay to go to journalists' home and then go and threaten them. I think that the issue here is that those people that the EFF has identified as so-called politicians are people that have done investigative stories against them. I don't think that they've identified people who are just journalists. Most of those people, there are stories that they have written that are very critical of them. I mean, you talk about somebody like Ranjeni Munsemi. It was Julius Malema who opened up to Ranjeni about the death of Mama Winnie and the impact that had on him. And to turn around and now tell us that, Ranjeni is now a politician, I think that's where we see the double standards. Because she had written critically around the EFF, I think we all understand that journalists must be criticized. But what we are saying is that it must be within the rules of engagement. The criticism can happen in columns, the criticism can be on ideas, but it should never be around naming journalists, the misogyny that we've seen on Twitter, and actually harassing and threatening them and identifying as people that EFF supporters should actually go out and make life difficult for them and deal with them decisively. And that's why we keep saying it is important for somebody in Julius Malema's position, leading one of the biggest parties in this country, to be very clear and argue on ideas and not to be labeling people.
How do you respond to his claim that the whole court case is actually underpinned under a strategy to protect Pravin Gordhan?
It's so nonsensical, that argument. I think these are the politics that he should be arguing with other politicians. I think that people have written quite critically on many politicians, including Pravin. So if we just look at the past week, it was News 24 that wrote critically around President Cyril Ramaphosa and the so-called emails that show what happened with his funding. It was actually a media house that actually exposed this. It was actually media houses that continue to show the rot, whichever side that it actually comes from. I think that we don't want to be drawn in of the Cyril Ramaphosa or Pravin Gordhan defense group or the EFF defense group. That is not our role. Our role is to actually reflect on those stories and actually get South Africans to understand what is going on. And that's why I keep saying, if Julius Malema feels that there is some missing information in the reportage in this country, he can actually occupy those pages and write about them. He is given interviews every single day and he speaks about his anger or his outrage, but why is he then identifying those journalists simply that they've written critically against him?
Okay. And just lastly, my last question, SANEF's position against journalists who are openly biased. We can all see, we know our colleagues, we can all see how they cross that ethical line and they do push political agendas. What does SANEF do to make sure that we remind those particular journalists what's important and really the broader cause of fostering a democratic South Africa?
2 seconds before you answer.
Yeah, guys, please. Come this way. Thank you.
Guys, they're live on television.
That was so wrong.
Okay. I think we have to be very careful to label journalists because your question was quite loaded. I think we must also remember that journalism is not a profession that has no limits. We have the Broadcasting Complaints Commission, we have the Press Council, and you can go to those institutions at any time to lay a complaint. I think that is quite important for all of us to remember because people like to think that journalists are probably acting as lone rangers and can do as they please, but that is not true. There are rules to what we do. There's a code of conduct that we actually have to follow, and we have to be very careful to not fall into the narrative of politicians, especially those that have been found doing the wrong thing, because it's not just about the EFF, it's other political parties. The first thing that they do is to excuse stories that have been written about them as fake news, stratcom, and we've seen increasingly that happens. I think we have to be very careful and name and identify stories when they're actually biased and actually report them to the Press Council or the Broadcasting Complaints Commission. I think in the past few years, we've seen some of the dramatic decisions that those two institutions have taken, forcing newspapers to actually apologize on lamp posts, which was extraordinary and never would have happened. I mean, people used to complain about very small apologies. Now we are seeing those apologies on front pages of newspapers. And what we are seeing in the past 2 years is that increasing labeling of stories as fake news or bias simply because people are found with their hands in the cookie jar. Let's rather use those institutions that are the regulatory bodies that are out there to actually deal with journalists that are biased and actually expose them.
Happy? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's where we're going to leave it. That's SANEF's Mahlatse Mahlase, who was speaking on behalf of SANEF straight after we had heard, of course, from the EFF leader, Julius Malema. And if you listen to both of them, two very different points of view about the same issue. She's saying that on the EFF was saying if you go on Twitter, the tough streets, you cannot be, shy there. And she's saying that the rules of engagement are the same, whether you're on social media, whether you're in real life, and that minding language that is used is very, very important. And she said that she was pleased that the EFF's lawyers had conceded that the language and the threats that were used on social media against some journalists was appalling, and that they dismissed them.
Yes, of course, and Mahlatse basically saying that we need to get to a point as a nation where facts and ideas are debated, not vulgar. And we did hear, of course, earlier on the EFF's leader, Julius Malema, saying that, they couldn't meet with Mahlatse as they were preparing for the elections. So Mahlatse saying that we tried to engage them on 2 occasions, we've written to them. We opted to come to the courts because there was nothing that we could do. So, but Malema earlier on saying that they will await the outcome of the courts, and as soon as that finishes, they will be able to engage SANEF, basically saying that they need us and we need them so that we can continue as normal.
All right, so you've heard both sides of the story, a little bit anyway, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this particular issue.